is our constant attention against the perpetual threats that assault these virtues. I'd like to thank the board of the National Constitution Center and its president and chief executive, Jeffrey Rosen. I've known Jeff for many years now, but recently, as we've started what will be a national conversation about the American Revolution, I've come to appreciate even more the wisdom and scholarship he brings to these issues, surpassed perhaps only by his love of the ideas themselves. I very much look forward to our conversation this evening. Finally, let me leave you with one more voice, also by our Thomas Paine. The sun never shined on a cause of greater worth. Every spot of the old world is overrun with oppression. Freedom hath been hunted round the globe. Oh, receive the fugitive and prepare in time an asylum for mankind. The birthday of a new world is at hand. Thank you for this extraordinary honor.
That was just beautiful, Ken, and you so inspired us by bringing us to Paine, to Thomas Paine, and the words and the ideals perfectly crystallize the struggles for liberty, equality, and democracy. Why did you choose Paine tonight?
Tonight, I think it's because, as I was explaining to the board earlier, that somehow, in the course of our investigations and our studies, what bubbled up all the time was the centrality of his words. We're familiar with the Declaration and Thomas Jefferson's, amended by Benjamin Franklin's words. We know the Constitution. We think we know it. There was something so direct and ordinary in the best sort of way about Paine that he kept floating up within each episode that we were struggling. And finally, we ended up labeling every single one of the 6 episodes after a quote, a phrase, a handful of words by Thomas Paine, because it felt like he was representing the us that I was just talking about. There was the kind of bigger U.S., which the men here, the statues in the next room that you and I were talking with, he had a kind of sense that, as he put it, the soul of America was not just in Philadelphia. Europeans thought, the British thought, you capture Philadelphia, you capture New York, you've got them. The soul of America was dispersed by the very act of our improvisatory gesture out into the world, that we could be a nation in the process of becoming, that we could actually be trusted with governing ourselves, that we could, as you know, in every daily catechism of your own, that requires that kind of denial and discipline and virtue, attempt at a virtuous life. And so there's something in his backstory, the unbelievable failure that out of it comes. I mean, you cannot imagine what his words did. And words matter, as we know. No other country on earth do words matter the way they matter here. And his words could lift us up, move us towards independency, something that even at the beginning of 1776, most were not sure we wanted. He could lift us up in the darkest moments, the times that tried men's souls, as he put it. He could articulate what we might be creating, an asylum for mankind. He understood the military thing that we could only conquer by a drawn game. That is to say, Washington didn't have to win every battle, he just couldn't surrender, he couldn't lose, and that eventually time, geography, and weather would make this the worst battle for the British. He understood about the soul of America, and he understood finally, our last episode, that the most sacred thing is the Union. And I think that maybe what all of us share, I know that you and I share, that all of us here share is just a sense that we are so much stronger bonded together, that this Republican experiment is a spectacular and joyous things, despite the fact that we have to always acknowledge that quite often there is a toxic byproduct to all of these stories, as Sarah pointed out, that sometimes it doesn't bring everybody along at the same time, and that's part of the story too. And in no way do you diminish the beauty of the tapestry by lifting up the rug and sweeping out some of the so-called dirt. That dirt is central to the definition of who we are as much as the beauty and the interweaving of that tapestry, the warp and woof of our story.
It's extraordinarily powerful. You spoke Paine's words, the still small voice. We all leaned in and wanted to learn more, and now you've used him to exemplify the entire struggle. It's riveting. And of course, he had a messy backstory, as we all do, and he published that follow-up book on the Age of Reason, which Jefferson told him not to publish because it was blasphemous, and he ended in distress. But that's part of how you draw us in. How do you, all of your work is the story of American history, as we saw from the highlight reel, but the American Revolution involves intellectual, political, military, cultural history. How did you approach this sprawling project, and what are you trying to achieve in the film?
The latter question is almost impossible to answer in terms of achievement, because I think a good story is an end in and of itself, and that any reasonably free and curious, perhaps ignorant but curious human being will find in it what they need to find, right? So the first part of the question is something I can address with slightly more confidence, which is that the name of this film in this case is The American Revolution. We're talking about a war. And so the skeletal structure is a sequence of battles that begins in protest, massacres in Boston, Tea Parties, this event off Rhode Island, all of this sort of stuff that culminates in Lexington and Concord and ends in Yorktown. Lots of battles. The same structure as the Civil War, the same structure as our film The War on the Second World War, the same structure of Vietnam. It's like the big mistake that we make when we think that American history is merely the sequence of presidential administrations punctuated by wars. It's a good skeletal structure, but that can't be it. And too often we just leave it at that and walk away and think that what happens in our revolution is just 55 white guys thinking great thoughts here in 1787, boom, done. It's much more complicated than that. And what a good history requires is a kind of bottom-up approach as well. So you have a military narrative that forms a kind of skeletal structure to which you can adorn not only the top-down but the bottom-up stories. So in this you will understand why, despite incredible failings and feats of clay, there is no one more important to the success of this experiment than George Washington. You will also understand what it's like to be a man named John Peters from a little village in Vermont who is sent by his neighbors out of respect for his intelligence and wisdom and sort of sense of self here to the First Continental Congress, and he gets here and he goes, whoa, 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 I'm not interested in this. And he's arrested 4 times on the way home. He's run out of town. He escapes to Canada. He forms a loyalist regiment. His wife and kids are also put out. One of them is an infant in arms. They make it to a frozen Lake Champlain where a British patrol boat picks them up and reunites them. He comes back down, and in the Battle of Bennington, part of Burgoyne's strategy to sort of divide New England from the mid-Atlantic states, he ends up in a losing battle as a loyalist regiment, part of a German, mostly German-controlled, led force against what they think is only a handful of patriots and turns out to be a significant force. He ends up as somebody is putting a bayonet in his breast, stopped by his ribcage, ends up, as he says, destroying him, his best friend growing up in New Haven. That's the American Revolution. It's the story of Quakers in Philadelphia who aren't buying into this new arrangement and are harassed and sometimes arrested and sometimes executed and sent out of here. It's about a kid who watches the British when they're first dispatched to Boston as an occupying police force, is mesmerized, young kid, not even 10 years old, mesmerized by the black Afro-Caribbean bands of the British Army and the drummers and particularly the fifers. And he learns to play the fife, John Greenwood does, and it ends up a few years later in Falmouth, Massachusetts, which is actually Portland, Maine today, because Maine was a department of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, hears about Lexington conquered and rushes down to try to help his parents who are trapped in Boston, and ends up joining the Continental Army and serves through all of this sort of stuff. And you can't make this up, ends up becoming a dentist whose most famous client, for whom he provides teeth, sometimes made of ivory from hippopotamuses, for George Washington. There is Betsy Ambler, who is from Yorktown, Virginia, whose family, very well-to-do, is impoverished by the revolution and their stand, and end up as refugees traveling all over the place. And of course, the war will end on her front doorstep. It is an important story to tell. There's James Fortin, who hears the Declaration read publicly here on July 9th, 1776. He is a free black person who never for a second doesn't believe that the words weren't meant for him, and spends his whole life working for the creation of the United States, working afterwards, and makes himself well-to-do and helps support the abolitionist movement. And when someone suggests that he applies for a pension that are available to revolutionary veterans, he said, no, I volunteered to fight. There are Native Americans who choose to ally themselves with the British or choose to ally themselves with the Americans. This is such a complex story that if you were pitching it to a Hollywood studio, they would see this as the cast of thousands and the kind of how the West was won. But this is all true. And we have spent the last 6 or 7 years sort of gathering those stories and 10 times as many, along with the familiar people. You'll hear John Adams, he loves Philadelphia. He loves the way it's laid out. Front Street, and then there's First and Second and Third, and they're named after trees, and he goes on and on and on about Philadelphia, and he's having fights with his wife, who says, comes down to us now in the most superficial way, remember the ladies. This thing we always attribute to Abigail. She basically, we do that like, okay, that's sort of cute, but she goes on to basically say the husbands have messed things up so badly that if you don't clean up your act, we're gonna take over. I'm for that. 4 daughters, I'm for that. I'm happy to have a female boss. It goes on and on and on, and I think that that's the stories that we're trying to tell. And Sarah's absolutely right. We will just worry over a comma or a semicolon or a shot or a 12th of a second. It's really important that we frame this. Wynton Marsalis said to us that music is the art of the invisible. It's the only art form that isn't visible. And if you think about it, it's therefore the fastest. And so I think the metaphors that we use while we're editing are always musical metaphors, where some of us are trained, most of us, including me, are not trained, but we understand that there is a music to life. There's a music to narrative. There's a music to idea.